The swamp water was rising, and the two FBI agents had seconds before the black sludge swallowed their faces forever. When Elena, a rogue Navy SEAL, and her massive German Shepherd, Titan, broke through the brush, they didn't just find two men. They found the architects of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. But as they dragged them out, they realized the true horror. The men they saved weren't victims. They were the targets of an execution squad currently closing in on their position. Subscribe to join this desperate fight for survival, comment your city below, and follow this story until the final, staggering truth. The mud was silent, but it was suffocating. Noah's eyes were bloodshot, bulging as the silt pressed against his nostrils. Beside him, Mason had stopped thrashing. He was already drowning. "Titan! Left!" Elena hissed, her voice barely a breath. The massive shepherd didn't hesitate. He plunged into the muck, his paws churning. Elena followed, her fingers clawing at the thick, cold sludge. She grabbed Noah's collar. He gasped, his lungs heaving for air that was mostly water. "Don't you dare die on me!" Elena growled, wrenching him upward. Noah coughed, a violent, wet sound. They know," he wheezed, his voice raw. "They know we're here." "Who knows?" Elena demanded, dragging him onto the solid bank. "The director!" Mason choked out, his face caked in gray filth. Elena froze. The director of the FBI? The betrayal hit her harder than a physical blow, but there was no time to process it. Titan let out a low, guttural snarl, his ears flattened. He wasn't looking at the marsh. He was looking at the tree line. "We have to move," Elena said, hauling Mason to his feet. "Now." "They planted a tracker in us," Noah said, panic rising. "That's how they found us before. If we don't get it out, we're dead in 10 minutes. "Give me your knife," Elena commanded. She sliced into Noah's shoulder without hesitation. He didn't even scream. He just gritted his teeth, his hand gripping her vest so hard his knuckles turned white. She pulled out a small metallic chip. It was still blinking a faint, rhythmic red. "That's not just a tracker," she whispered, her blood turning to ice. "That's a detonator." The forest behind them exploded in light. A suppressed rifle round tore through the trunk of the tree next to Elena's head. Bark sprayed into the air. "Go!" Elena shoved them forward. "Titan, find a line!" They scrambled through the dense brush, their clothes torn to shreds. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was calculating, cold and lethal. She knew the layout of this sector, but they were being funneled. "They're hurting us," she shouted over her shoulder. "Into what?" Mason gasped, clutching his side. "A kill zone." Titan suddenly stopped, his hackles raised to the sky. He let out a sharp, piercing bark and bolted toward a hollowed-out log. He circled it, his teeth bared. Elena reached the log and looked inside. There was a radio, sitting on a bed of dry moss, already transmitting. "Someone's listening," Elena said, grabbing the device. A voice crackled through, cold, familiar, and terrifyingly calm. "Elena, you should have walked away. You're a SEAL, not a savior. If you don't drop those agents, the marsh becomes your grave." "Who is this?" Elena barked. The voice chuckled. "The person signing your death warrant." The line went dead. Suddenly, a flare ignited above the canopy, bathing the swamp in an eerie, ghostly white light. They were exposed. "Run!" Elena commanded. They sprinted through the water, the mud clutching at their boots like dying hands. Behind them, the sounds of heavy boots hit the water, too many for a simple patrol. They were being hunted by a professional team. "Elena, I can't." Mason collapsed, his strength failing. "Just leave us. You're a civilian now. Don't throw your life away for two feds." Elena looked at Titan, who was standing guard, his tail low, his eyes locked on the darkness. She looked back at the two men, their faces masks of mud and fear. "I don't leave people behind," she said, pulling Mason up. "And my dog doesn't like losers. Pick up your pace." A bullet whistled past her ear, splashing into the water inches from Titan. The dog lunged, a blur of fur and muscle disappearing into the dark. A second later, a horrific scream echoed through the marsh, followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the mud. "Titan!" Elena yelled. Silence followed. Then, the rhythmic padding of heavy paws returned. Titan emerged from the shadows, his muzzle stained with something dark. He stood by Elena, waiting for the next command. "You killed him," Noah whispered, staring at the dog. "He stopped a threat," Elena replied, her voice devoid of emotion. Suddenly, a laser sight danced across Mason's chest. Elena didn't think. She tackled him, the bullet tearing into the space where he had been standing a second before. "They're everywhere," Mason cried. "Then we changed the game," Elena said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. "They think they're hunting us. Shang, we're going to show them exactly what happens when you corner a predator." She pulled a grenade from her tactical vest, a relic from her last mission. "Hold your breath," she whispered. She tossed the device into the stagnant pool behind them. The explosion rocked the earth, sending a wall of water and debris into the air. In the chaos, she grabbed Noah and Mason, hauling them into the thickest, most impenetrable part of the marsh. "Stay low," she ordered. The searchlights swept over them, missing their hiding spot by mere inches. The hunters moved past, their boots crunching on the dead leaves. Elena watched them go, her finger hovering over her sidearm. "We're not going to survive this, are we?" Noah whispered. Elena looked at the darkness, then at Titan, who sat perfectly still, a silent guardian in the abyss. "That depends," she murmured, "on whether you're ready to tell me what's actually on that drive you were carrying." Noah hesitated, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a sealed, waterproof casing. "Everything. The names, the bank accounts, the locations. If this gets out, it brings down the whole agency." Elena took the drive, her hand steady. The stakes had just shifted from survival to war. She looked at the horizon, where the first hint of morning was trying to break through. "Then let's make sure it gets out," she said. But as she spoke, her radio, the one she had taken from the log, chirped to life. It wasn't the voice from before. It was a woman's voice, sharp and commanding. "Agent Mercer, we know you have the drive. Drop it, or we kill the hostages we currently have at your sister's house." Elena's heart stopped. She looked at Titan. He let out a low, mournful whine. "You think you've won?" Elena whispered into the receiver. "You just made this personal." She turned to Noah and Mason, her expression unreadable. "Change of plans," she said. "We're not running anymore. We're going on the offensive." The betrayal stung more than the cold swamp water, but Elena didn't have the luxury of grief. She looked at the two FBI agents, Noah and Mason, who were still shivering in the dark, and then at Titan, whose ears were twitching toward the sound of approaching rotors. The sister mention wasn't just a threat, it was a signature. Whoever had them in their crosshairs knew exactly how to dismantle Elena's composure. "Noah, get up," Elena commanded, her voice dropping an octave. "We aren't going to my sister's. We're going to the only place they'd never expect us to hide. The local precinct. If the leak is as high as you say, the precinct is the only place left with enough chaos to mask our movements." Noah blinked, his face pale. "The precinct? Elena, that's suicide. That's where the evidence processing center is. If the director has eyes there, he'll have us in cuffs before we can even breathe." "Exactly," Elena said, a grim smile touching her lips. "They'll be expecting us to run for the border, not walk straight into the lion's den. Titan, stay close." As they moved, every shadow seemed to stretch into a gunman. Elena kept her hand hovering over her holster, her eyes scanning the tree line for the telltale glint of optics. She didn't have to wait long. A silent bullet snapped a branch just inches from Noah's ear. He tumbled into the dirt, eyes wide with terror. Before he could panic, Elena grabbed his collar and yanked him behind a fallen oak. "Keep your head down or you're dead," she snapped. "They're using thermal imaging. We need to mask our heat signatures." "How?" Mason wheezed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Elena pointed to the stagnant, freezing mud. "We coat ourselves in this. It's the only way to confuse their sensors." "That's disgusting," Mason started, but seeing the look in Elena's eyes, he stopped. Without another word, he and Noah smeared the icy sludge over their jackets. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic thumping of a drone. Suddenly, Titan went rigid. He didn't growl. He gave a single sharp yelp and bolted toward a patch of tall grass. "Titan, no!" Elena hissed, but the dog was already gone. "He's giving us away," Noah whispered, fear clawing at his throat. "He's doing his job," Elena countered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She moved toward the grass, her weapon leveled. Suddenly, a muffled shout erupted, followed by a thud. Elena rounded the corner and found Titan standing over a man in tactical gear, a man holding a remote detonator. The guy was pinned, his hand inches from the button. Elena kicked the device away and looked at the man's face. It was one of the local police deputies she had shared a coffee with just 3 days ago. "You," she whispered, the betrayal hitting her like a physical blow. "You were the one watching my house?" The deputy spat at her feet, his eyes devoid of remorse. "You should have stayed out of the marsh, Mercer. You're playing a game you don't understand. The director is just the tip of the spear. You have no idea how deep this goes." "Tell me," Elena demanded, pressing the barrel of her gun into his temple. The deputy laughed, a wet, choking sound. "The files you think you have? They're already compromised. The moment you uploaded them to your server, they triggered a secondary signal. You aren't saving the world, Elena. You're just finishing the loop." A sudden realization struck Elena with paralyzing force. She hadn't just been tracked. She had been used as a delivery system. The drive they were carrying wasn't evidence. It was a Trojan horse designed to wipe the entire FBI server once it was plugged in. "Noah, drop it!" Elena screamed, knocking the casing out of Noah's hand just as a bright blue LED light began to pulse from within it. The drive hissed, melting into a puddle of toxic sludge on the forest floor. The ground beneath them trembled, a small, controlled implosion of the Earth itself. They had been carrying a localized electromagnetic pulse device, not data. They weren't trying to stop us from finding the truth, Mason whispered, his face reflecting the orange glow of the dying tech. They were using us to destroy the evidence that actually existed. The realization was a gut punch. Elena felt the weight of the last 24 hours crushing her. She had been played, manipulated by the very people she was trying to expose, but she didn't have time to fall apart. From the darkness, more lights appeared, dozens of them closing in from all sides. They weren't just being hunted anymore. They were being harvested. "We need a new plan," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly. "If that drive was a fake, then the real evidence is still in the marsh." "How do you know?" Noah asked, Cheating clutching his side. "Because they wouldn't have gone to this much trouble to trick us if the real files weren't still hidden here," Elena said, a spark of resolve returning to her eyes. Titan tracked the smell. Not the people, the disinfectant, the chemical they used on the prisoners. Titan sniffed the air, his tail wagging once. Then he turned and headed back toward the most treacherous part of the swamp, the dead zone, where no one ever dared to go. They buried it in the waste, Elena realized, the chemical disposal site. As they trudged deeper into the sludge, the air grew thick with the smell of sulfur and rot. Every step was a battle against the sinking ground. Suddenly, the ground beneath Mason gave way entirely. He didn't scream, he just sank, his hands clawing at the air as he was pulled into a sinkhole. "Mason!" Noah lunged, but Elena caught his arm. "Wait!" she warned, looking down into the pit. Beneath the water, a massive, rusted steel hatch was visible. It wasn't a sinkhole. It was a bunker entrance. "They're keeping the real files down there," Elena whispered. But as they stared, the hatch began to creak open from the inside. A silhouette emerged, gun drawn, silhouetted against the dim light of the tunnel. It wasn't a man in a tactical vest. It was a woman, wearing the uniform of a high-ranking official, the very woman who had threatened Elena over the radio. "I told you not to come back, Schmerzer," the woman said, her voice echoing in the hollow space. "But I suppose you never did know when to quit." Elena stood her ground, her hand on Titan's collar. She didn't look at the gun. She looked at the woman's eyes. "You think you've won?" Elena challenged, her voice steady. "You've just brought the evidence right to us." The woman laughed, but it didn't reach her eyes. "There is no evidence, Elena. There is only the version of the story that I write." Suddenly, a massive surge of water erupted from the bunker, knocking the woman off balance. Titan seized the opening, lunging forward with a speed that defied physics. The woman fired, but the shot went wide, shattering the silence of the marsh. In the chaos, Elena grabbed the edge of the bunker door, pulling herself inside as the entire sector began to flood. They weren't just in the middle of a conspiracy anymore. They were at the heart of the machine. And as the door slammed shut behind them, sealing them in the dark, Elena knew they had only one chance to survive: to rip the truth out of the walls themselves, even if the building came down on top of them. The hatch groaned under the pressure of the rising swamp water, a metallic shriek that vibrated through Elena's teeth as she slammed the locking mechanism home. They were inside, but the air was stale, tasting of ozone and long-buried secrets. Titan paced the narrow concrete corridor, to his claws clicking rhythmically, a sound that echoed like a countdown. "If this is the nerve center, where are the files?" Noah gasped, his voice trembling as he leaned against the damp wall, Everything here is encrypted, Elena. If we try to force the mainframe, we'll trigger a wipe. Elena ignored him, her attention fixed on the terminal at the end of the hall. It wasn't just a computer. It was linked directly to the city's power grid. She realized then that the trafficking operation wasn't just using the marsh. They were using the city's own infrastructure to launder their communications. They aren't just hiding information, Elena said, her eyes tracking the flickering screens. They're using the city's power consumption to hide data packets. Every time a streetlight dims in Harbor Pike, a file is being moved. That's insane, Mason whispered, stepping forward. That would require an insider at the municipal level, to someone who controls the grid. Exactly, Elena replied, her fingers dancing across the console. Someone like the mayor's chief of staff. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. Total darkness enveloped them, save for the faint red emergency glow. A heavy thud sounded from behind the hatch. Someone was trying to cut through the door. "They're coming in," Titan growled, his hackles brushing against Elena's leg. "Noah, get to that access panel," Elena ordered, shoving a multi-tool into his hands. "Bypass the security, but don't pull the plug. We need to copy the ghost data, not erase it. If I do this, it'll trip a silent alarm at the FBI field office," Noah warned. "Let it," Elena said, her voice turning icy. "We need them to come here. We need them to see that we have the leverage." The hatch buckled, sparks flying as a cutting torch ate through the steel. Elena stood in the center of the room, her weapon raised, waiting. She wasn't just a Navy SEAL anymore. She was a woman backed into a corner with nothing left to lose. "They're through," Mason shouted as the door groaned and tilted inward. A flash-bang grenade rolled across the floor, its high-pitched whine piercing their ears. Elena dropped to a knee, shielding Titan with her body. The room exploded into chaos. Masked figures surged through the gap, but Elena was faster. She fired 2 precise shots, not to kill, but to neutralize. They weren't soldiers. They were private contractors, and they moved with a hesitation that betrayed their lack of true combat experience. "Cover the door!" she roared. Noah's fingers flew across the panel. "I'm in. I'm downloading. Wait, this isn't just trafficking data. It's a list of names. High-ranking officials, judges, federal agents. Elena, this is a blueprint for a shadow government." "Keep downloading," she shouted, putting another round into the doorframe to force the attackers back. A voice boomed through the hallway speakers, a voice Elena recognized from the radio. It was the woman again, cold and unshaken. "You think you're heroes? You're just evidence being collected. Look at the camera, Elena." Elena turned toward the small, blinking red light in the corner of the ceiling. "I see you," Elena replied, her voice steady. "And I'm going to make sure the world sees you too." "You have no idea who you're fighting," the woman laughed. "That drive you destroyed? That was just the bait. We wanted you to think you'd lost the evidence. We needed you to come here, to this specific bunker, so we could consolidate our loose ends. You didn't break in, Elena. You walked into a vault." The realization hit like a physical blow. The bunker wasn't a secret base. It was a trap designed to be sealed. The ceiling began to hum, and the heavy metal ventilation grates hissed as they began to pump a heavy, colorless gas into the room. Chemical suppression, Elena realized, her vision blurring at the edges. "They're not going to kill us. They're going to erase our memories." "Elena, I can't finish the download," Noah cried, his legs giving out beneath him. Titan whined, his head drooping. Elena felt her own strength draining away. She looked at the terminal, then at the heavy steel door. If she moved now, she could hold the door, but she would lose the data. If she stayed, they would all be captured. "Titan," she whispered, her voice thick. "Find the vent." The dog looked at her, his eyes clouded, but he understood. He lunged at a loose panel near the floor, his claws tearing at the rusted bolts. With a final, desperate heave, the panel popped open, revealing a crawl space leading to the outside. "Noah, Mason, get in," she commanded, dragging them toward the hole. "What about you?" Noah gasped, barely conscious. "I'm staying to make sure they get what's coming to them," Elena said, her eyes flashing with a final, defiant spark. She shoved them into the vent, Titan pushing from behind. As the last of them vanished, Elena turned back to the terminal. She didn't need the download to finish. She just needed to send it. She slammed her hand onto the broadcast button, linking the system to every news outlet in the state. The screen flashed. Upload complete. The door burst open, and a dozen armed men swarmed the room. Elena didn't reach for her gun. She folded her arms, a triumphant smile on her face as the alarms finally began to wail. Not the alarm of a trap, but the alarm of a whistle being blown. "You're too late," she whispered. The lead attacker stopped, his radio buzzing with frantic reports from his superiors. He looked at the screen, his face turning ashen. "You just broadcasted everything," he stammered, looking at Elena as if she were a ghost. "I didn't just broadcast it," Elena said, standing up, her exhaustion replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "I set it to loop. Every 10 minutes, that file is going to every major server in the country. You can kill me, but you can't kill the truth." The man hesitated, his gun lowering. In that second of doubt, a massive, muscular form lunged from the shadows. Titan hadn't left. He had stayed. The dog slammed into the man, pinning him to the floor. Elena didn't wait. She grabbed her sidearm and vaulted over the desk, disappearing into the darkness of the hall. The bunker was crumbling. The gas was thick, but for the first time in her life, the path ahead was crystal clear. She didn't need to run anymore. She needed to survive long enough to watch them fall. Outside, the first police sirens began to wail, but they weren't the local precinct's vehicles. They were state troopers, federal investigators, and local press. The trap had failed, and the hunters were about to become the hunted. Elena stepped out into the night, Titan by her side, Yudi watching as the lights of the city began to flicker, not in a rhythmic, controlled way, but in a chaotic, desperate scramble to cover up the cracks. "It's over," Noah said, emerging from the brush behind her, his clothes stained and his face bruised. "But look at the lake, Elena." Elena turned. The entire surface of the marsh was lighting up, illuminated by a dozen searchlights. The shadow government wasn't going to let them leave. They were launching a full-scale assault on the entire sector to bury the site. "They're going to burn it all down," Mason whispered, staring at the incoming lines of vehicles. Elena looked at her dog, then at the horizon. "Then we don't go to them," she said, her voice hard as steel. "We bring the fight to the front steps of the people who ordered this. Noah, get the car. We're going to the Capitol." The engine of the stolen SUV roared as they tore away from the marsh, the red glow of the bunker's internal alarms fading into the rearview mirror. Noah's hands were shaking violently as he clutched the laptop, the screen reflecting his frantic, sweat-streaked face. Beside him, Mason was struggling to stem the bleeding from a gunshot wound in his side, his breath coming in sharp, shallow whistles that signaled a collapsed lung. Elena didn't look at them. Her eyes were locked on the road, her foot buried deep into the floorboard. She knew the state troopers wouldn't just let them pass. They were part of the firewall meant to keep the truth from ever leaving Harbor Pike. "They've set up a blockade at the county line," Noah shouted, pointing at the laptop as the GPS recalculated a new, impossible route. "Elena, there are 3 patrol cars and a tactical unit. If we hit that, we're not just stopping, we're being executed." "Then we don't hit the blockade," Elena muttered, swinging the wheel sharply toward a narrow, just abandoned logging trail. The SUV swerved, tires screaming against the loose gravel. Titan, sitting upright in the back, let out a sharp, rhythmic bark, his focus locked on the thermal signature of a helicopter circling low above the canopy. "They've got air support," Mason choked out, his voice barely audible. "We're never going to make the capital at this rate." "We aren't going to the capital," Elena said, her voice eerily calm. "We're going to the regional broadcast center. It's closer, and if we can hijack their satellite uplink, we don't need to drive anywhere. The truth will be in every living room in the country within 10 minutes." The sudden realization that they were switching targets from a physical location to a digital one shifted the entire gravity of their mission. But just as Elena banked the car, a massive collision rocked them from the side. A heavy black sedan had rammed them, trying to force the SUV off the cliffside path. Elena fought the steering wheel, so her knuckles white, as the SUV skidded toward the edge of a deep ravine. "Titan! Brace!" she screamed. The dog lunged, planting his weight against the console, helping Elena stabilize the vehicle just as a tire slipped over the precipice. With a final agonizing lurch, they slammed back onto the dirt. The black sedan wasn't done. It pulled alongside, a masked driver leveling a submachine gun at Elena's window. "Shoot back!" Noah yelled, scrambling to find the handgun Elena had left on the dash. "No, don't waste the ammo," Elena countered, swerving the SUV to slam into the sedan's side. Metal shrieked against metal, sparks showering the forest floor. The sedan wobbled, its steering failing as the heavy impact shredded its front wheel. It spiraled into the trees, disappearing with a sickening, final crash. "One down," Elena whispered, her chest heaving. "There are more coming," Mason warned, glancing at his watch. "The broadcast center is 5 miles ahead. Mind if we don't get there before the shift change, the security system will be locked down." The silence in the car was short-lived. A sudden, piercing vibration from Noah's laptop signaled an incoming connection. He opened the file, his eyes widening. "Elena, you need to see this. It's not just the list of names. It's a message from the director. He's already uploaded his own version of the events. He's telling the public that we are the ones who staged the trafficking ring, and that we are the ones who killed the deputies at the marsh." Elena's heart skipped a beat. The twist was devastating. They weren't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting a narrative that had already labeled them as monsters. "They're framing us in real time," Noah said, his voice cracking. "The whole state thinks we're the villains. We're driving into a wall of public hatred." "Then we give them the truth," Elena said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, newfound resolve. "And if they want to play the media game, we'll turn the volume up until the whole system shatters." They reached the broadcast center, a monolithic concrete structure bathed in floodlights, It was guarded, but not like a fortress. It was guarded like a crime scene. Elena realized why. The attackers were already here, waiting to intercept whoever tried to use the uplink. "There's a side entrance," Elena said, stopping the SUV in the shadow of a maintenance shed. "Noah, you're the tech expert. You get to the main server. Mason, stay with the car. Can you move?" "I can hold a trigger," Mason growled, his face pale but his eyes fierce. "Titan, you're with me," Elena commanded. They sprinted through the darkness, the perimeter silent. As they reached the maintenance door, Elena felt a strange pull in her gut, a familiar sensation from her SEAL days. She motioned for Titan to wait, pressing her ear to the cold metal. "It's too quiet," she whispered. She pushed the door open, her gun drawn. Inside, the control room was empty, the flickering monitors showing the very news broadcast that was currently painting them as domestic terrorists. But there was something wrong. The cables weren't just connected. They were being rerouted. "They aren't just broadcasting," Elena realized, her stomach churning. "They're using this center to scramble all regional emergency communications. If they finish this, nobody will be able to call the police, the fire department, or even an ambulance. And they're effectively shutting down the city's ability to cry for help. If we stop the broadcast, we turn the city back on," Noah whispered, his fingers flying across the terminal. But as he made the connection, a hand emerged from the shadows, a gun pressed firmly against the back of his neck. It was the woman from the marsh, her face a mask of cold, calculated precision. "You really should have stayed in the mud, Elena," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "You're an hour too late. The system is already dead." Elena felt her blood turn to ice. She looked at the terminal, then at the woman, and finally at Titan, who was crouched low, his muscles coiled like a spring. "You think you've won?" Elena said, her hand tightening on her sidearm. "You've made one fatal mistake. You assumed I came here to broadcast the truth." The woman laughed. "What else could you possibly want?" "I didn't come to broadcast it," Elena replied, her voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "I came to delete your access to the city's grid entirely. If you can't control the lights, you can't hide the truth. Noah, now." Noah slammed the enter key. The room went pitch black, a massive surge of feedback screaming through the speakers. Elena didn't hesitate. She lunged, tackling the woman to the floor just as the power failed. Titan followed, a blur of golden fur, his jaws closing on the woman's wrist, forcing her to drop the weapon. "Get the data out." "John Noah!" Elena shouted over the rising wail of the sirens. "I'm trying, but the uplink is being blocked by a secondary signal from the tower," Noah cried. Elena scrambled up, her heart pounding. She looked at the terminal, realizing they had been tricked again. The signal wasn't coming from the tower. It was coming from the laptop Noah was holding. "The laptop!" Elena screamed. "It's a beacon! They're tracking us through the device!" She grabbed the laptop and hurled it across the room into a heavy, reinforced trash bin. The moment it hit the metal, a muffled pop echoed through the room, followed by the smell of burning circuits. The room went silent. "They can't see us anymore," Elena breathed. "But we're still here and they know the location. Mason, how are you holding up?" Mason's voice crackled over her earpiece, strained and weak. "They're outside the front door, Elena. I think I've bought us 2 minutes, but they're going to breach." Elena looked at Noah, then at the wall of screens, which were now flickering back to life. A single image began to crawl across the displays. The footage of the marsh, the truth of the trafficking ring, the proof of the conspiracy. It wasn't just a broadcast. It was a digital confession. "It's going out," Noah whispered, his voice trembling with relief. But as the files hit the public servers, the building groaned, just a deep, structural sound that shook the very foundation beneath their feet. Elena realized with a final, chilling certainty, the building wasn't just a broadcast center. It was a rigged shell. They weren't just here to capture them. They were here to destroy the center and everything inside it, to bury the truth under 1,000 tons of steel and concrete. "Run," Elena commanded. "We've done our part. Now we fight for the exit." The ceiling joists groaned, a low, tectonic rumble that warned of the building's impending collapse. Smoke curled through the vents like dark fingers, choking the air, but Elena didn't flinch. She grabbed Noah by the vest and propelled him toward the service elevator, her boots sliding on the slick, debris-covered floor. Mason was already dragging himself toward the stairwell, his face drained of color, his hand pressing a makeshift bandage against his side. Every second was a gamble against gravity, and as a support beam buckled overhead, showering them in plaster and glass, the exit seemed like 1,000 miles away. "We have to get to the rooftop," Elena shouted over the rising wail of the sirens. "The landing pad is the only way off this floor before the central stairwell gives way." "The elevators are dead, Elena," Noah yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "The power is completely fried." "Then we climb." She shoved him toward the emergency ladder, her pulse thumping a frantic rhythm in her ears. Titan was already ahead, his paws scrambling against the metal rungs, his golden coat shimmering in the strobe-like flashes of the emergency lights. As they reached the 3rd floor, a heavy blast door slammed shut, triggered by the building's failing automated systems. They were trapped. Elena threw her weight against the door, but it was locked tight from the outside. She didn't hesitate. She pulled a breaching charge from her tactical vest, a desperate tool she'd kept since the marsh. "Get back!" she commanded. The explosion was muffled, a concussive thud that rattled their teeth, but it forced the door open just enough. They squeezed through, the heat now unbearable. They were in the main archives, surrounded by rows of burning servers. Among the flames, Elena saw something that stopped her cold. A series of photographs on a desk, pictures of her own sister, dated from only yesterday. "They weren't just kidnapping people for trafficking," Elena whispered, her blood turning to ice. "They were mapping my family. This was all a personal vendetta against me from the start." "Why?" Noah gasped, clutching his side. "Why target a retired SEAL?" "Because I saw something in the desert 5 years ago that I was supposed to forget," Elena replied, a grim realization settling over her. The marsh, the kidnapping, the framing. It was all just a theater to bring me to this room so they could finish what they started back then. A sudden sound of heavy boots hit the floor behind them. It wasn't the police. It was a kill squad, their shadows stretching long and menacing against the walls. Elena turned, her weapon raised, her eyes locked on the figure leading them, the man she had once called her commanding officer. "Hello, Elena," he said, his voice calm, almost fatherly. "I told you. You never could leave the past buried." "You're the one pulling the strings?" Elena said, her voice dripping with venom. "All these lives, just to get to me?" You were always the best, Elena. That's why you're the only one left to eliminate. He signaled, and the squad leveled their weapons. But Elena had spent her life learning how to vanish. She didn't fire. She shot the fire suppression system's main release valve. A wall of freezing high-pressure foam erupted between them and the squad, turning the room into a blinding, white-out nightmare. Now! Elena screamed, grabbing Noah and bolting into the thick, synthetic snow. They reached the roof, the cold night air hitting them like a relief. But there was no helicopter waiting. Instead, the roof was occupied by a lone, dark figure. The woman from the marsh, holding a detonator. End of the line, Elena, she sneered, her finger hovering over the button. The truth you broadcasted, it's already been scrubbed by the network. No one saw it. No one will ever know. You think so? Noah chuckled, his voice surprisingly steady. Check your phone, counselor. The woman frowned, pulling out her device. Her face went pale. The footage wasn't just on the network. It had been mirrored to thousands of private devices across the city. The entire state was watching her, right now, on their personal screens. The scrubbing had only fueled the spread of the data. You didn't just broadcast it, she whispered, looking at Elena with newfound terror. You turned the entire city into a witness. And witnesses don't forget, Elena said, stepping forward. She lunged, not for the detonator, but for the woman's radio, tearing it from her belt and throwing it over the edge of the building. The squad was coming up the stairs. They would be here in seconds. Elena grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher and smashed the emergency beacon light, signaling the incoming police choppers that were circling the city. They're coming! Noah shouted, pointing to the horizon. A dozen spotlights pierced the darkness, focusing on the roof. The kill squad burst through the door, only to freeze when they saw the sky filled with federal enforcement birds. The woman dropped the detonator, her arrogance evaporating into the cold night air. The game was up. Elena stood by the edge of the roof, the wind whipping her hair. Beside her, Titan sat tall, his eyes alert and fearless, a guardian who had never left her side. She looked down at the city lights. Harbor Pike was waking up, 1 million people watching the screens, 1 million people demanding justice. We didn't just survive, Elena said, her voice ringing out across the quiet rooftop. We changed the world. She walked over to Noah and Mason, who were leaning against each other, battered but alive. She didn't need a medal, and she didn't need the glory. She had the truth, and for the first time in years, she had peace. As the police choppers descended, sorties, their blades washing the roof in a frantic golden light, Elena felt the weight of the last few days finally lifting. The story didn't end with a bang, but with the quiet sound of handcuffs clicking shut. The corruption that had festered in the marsh for years was being dragged into the harsh, uncompromising light of day. Elena watched as the people who had tried to destroy her were led away, their heads bowed, their power stripped to nothing. She turned and walked toward the stairwell, and Titan trotting faithfully at her heels. They descended into the cool, dark morning, leaving the chaos behind. They were heading home, back to the simple quiet of the lake, back to the life they had fought so hard to protect. What now? Noah asked as they reached the lobby, the air filled with the chaotic energy of a city in the middle of a reckoning. Elena looked at her dog, then at the dawn breaking over the horizon. Now, we live, and we never choose ever look away again. The shadow of the past had finally been outrun, And for every person who had been silenced by the powerful, the morning sun brought a new, undeniable promise. Justice may be slow, but it is absolute, and it always finds those who dare to stand against the dark.